Welcome to Radical Responsibility, the podcast dedicated to ridding the world of blame and shame, where we explore the issues you care about from a unique perspective. 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life, day in and day out. Hi, welcome to the Radical Responsibility podcast. This is your host, Maull. Today, I'm going to share a conversation with you that I had with Erica Zelfand. She's a naturopathic doctor who's very involved in psychotherapy and especially psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and all kinds of healing work. And we talk about the global mental health epidemic and both that is really impacting all of us and the entire world, and especially those of us living in modern cultures, and also looking at how that manifest across the fault lines of many kinds of injustice as well. And the necessity for really innovative psychotherapeutic approaches and methodologies. And we had quite a bit of conversation about psychedelics and kind of demystifying the world of psychedelics through the scientific research and really understanding their potential for positive therapeutic impact, and looking how that could really transform our mental health system, right? The means that we bring to people to help with mental health challenges, and the way the whole system is structured, which in many ways is not serving currently. So this is really a great conversation with someone who's thoroughly committed to transforming our mental health system and is incredibly knowledgeable about the science of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as well as plant medicines. And I'm really happy to be here today with Dr. Erica Zelfand. Welcome, Dr. Zelfand.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you be here and be part of this summit. And I'm going to share a bit of your background, your bio with our audience so they're more familiar with your work, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Sound good?
That's great.
Okay. Dr. Erica Zelfand is a naturopathic family physician renowned for her wide-ranging expertise in both conventional and natural therapies. Her approach is rooted in patient-centric, nature-honoring methodologies that seek to identify and address root causes of health issues. Treating a diverse patient demographic from newborns to the elderly, Dr. Zelfand's areas of specialization encompass preventive medicine, chronic illness management, endocrinology, and integrative mental health. In addition to clinical work, Dr. Zelfand is a sought-after medical writer, educator, and speaker who frequently lectures on psychedelic science at medical institutions globally. She also facilitates therapeutic psychospiritual experiences and provides professional training through her educational platform. Possessing an infectious zest for life, Dr. Zelfand shares her vast knowledge, deep respect for nature, and her characteristic sense of humor with patients, clients, colleagues, and worldwide audiences alike. So that's a big bio, and I'm really glad to have you here today. I'd love to start with kind of a big overview question, since your clinical practice blends Eastern and Western approaches, holistic perspectives. And so let's start with, how does the integration of these different modes of knowing influence your understanding of mind, consciousness, and spirit, whatever we want to call it, particularly in relationship to the use of psychedelic therapy? So these different sort of worldviews and ways of knowing, we have the Western scientific, we have the Eastern contemplative, we have the holistic integrative perspective, and we have the indigenous perspective. So I wonder if you could talk about how the integration of this works out and plays out for you in your work.
Yeah. I think it would help if, instead of focusing on the kinds of therapies, meaning, is it herbal, is it pharmaceutical, is it psychedelic, is it energetic, rather than focusing on the types of the therapies, instead focusing on the philosophy really helps guide how I work with clients and how it's different. And the philosophy is, as you mentioned in my bio, it's very patient-centered. And so I sometimes get called a healer, and I don't feel comfortable with that label because I really don't do any healing. The healing happens within the person's own being. Every person has their own inner healer, their own inner wisdom, and it is our inherent nature to want to come into equilibrium and come into harmony. And coming at it from that way, when I see someone who has a disease, I don't necessarily see the disease as the problem. I see the disease as that intelligent organism's adaptation to a problem. And coming at it from that way, I then see, okay, what is the best way that I can enhance the power of this person's inner healer and remove the obstacles to that process from taking place? And so I often use this analogy of someone stepped on a nail and they come and see me and they say, Dr. Erica, I've got a nail in my foot. Please heal me. What I would do is I would remove the nail from their foot. So all I'm doing there is removing the obstacle to healing, right? And then I would clean out the wound. And then I would tell them, don't walk on your foot. And I'd ask when their last tetanus shot was. And what I'm doing there is I'm just creating the proper conditions for healing. But what actually knits that whole together has nothing to do with me. That's the person's own healing capacity. And sometimes people ask me, well, how do you justify using psychedelics and herbs and pharmaceutical medicines? Don't they all kind of argue with one another? And they don't when I use this philosophy. So with each individual person, I see, what is this inner healer trying to heal? What's stopping that from happening? And what tools here in my toolkit are going to support them the best in that process? And so in that way, there's harmony. And then the tools in my toolkit become ways for me to customize how to best support my patients, rather than pushing my opinions or belief systems on that's a bad medicine and that's a good medicine, which I don't really buy into.
So I'm really intrigued by what you just said about being uncomfortable with the label of being a healer, and also about pointing people back to gain access to their inner healer, their inner capacity for healing, self-healing. And so I'm curious if what is the relationship between of psychedelic medicines helping people access their inner healer versus other things like herbal medicine and other interventions that you employ in your practice?
I think there's a reason that we have so many different kinds of medicine on this planet, because different things are going to work better or worse for different people at different chapters of their lives. And what I find with psychedelic medicine is you can use it like a pharmaceutical, or you can use it like an energetic medicine, or you can use it like an herbal medicine. And it doesn't actually have to do with whether or not the substance is a synthetic or a natural. For example, ketamine versus psilocybin. It's how you use it. So are you using it, for example, in the case of ketamine, which I do administer ketamine in my practice, I could use ketamine like a pharmaceutical in the sense of you have depression because there's a dysregulation in the glutamate system in your brain. We're going to tweak the brain chemistry and you're going to feel better, right? That is a very allopathic or conventional way of thinking about disease, right? The problem is depression. Another way to use ketamine is there's a disharmony between your body and your spirit. And we are going to use this medicine to help deepen your relationship with your spirit so that it can guide what you need to do next in your life. Same drug, but very different uses. And something I really appreciate about psychedelics is they allow us to get to that psycho-spiritual layer much more effectively than most of the other types of medicine that I have access to. Homeopathy does that as well, but I'm just going to confess I'm not very good at that modality. I've taken additional coursework in it. It's like you either have the brain for it or you don't. But a medicine that is going to bring somebody back home into themselves, understanding that there's nothing wrong with them. There are just things that are in harmony and out of harmony. And then comes our work, right? There's this saying, after enlightenment, the laundry. And sometimes patients coming from a Western medical model, they treat psychedelics as if they are pharmaceutical medicines that are just more natural. Meaning, I want to take this drug because it needs to fix my anxiety, which is very different than there's some kind of disharmony within me and I could use some support into getting into alignment. And the latter takes more work. It needs more than just the drug, and it works better, and the effects last longer. So it's the tool, but it's also how we use it. And it's also how the patient approaches it as well.
So does that begin with how you frame the process for the patient? In other words, you could frame it in a somewhat pharmaceutical or conventional allopathic way that they're presenting a problem and you're going to provide them with some medicine that can fix it. Or you can present it in this more holistic, integrative way, inviting them to be more engaged in the process and understanding that what they're presenting represents some kind of underlying disharmony, trauma, what have you, disconnection. And so you're inviting them to engage with the psychedelic medicine in a way that's addressing that. And so the way you frame it for the patient, would really, again, we're talking about set and setting here, right? So this is the set part. And so also curious, are you able to do this with all of your patients, or does it kind of depend on their willingness, how much they're willing to be involved in the healing process? They may arrive in their work with you with that mindset. I came to the doctor wanting you to just give me some medicine to fix this. So I'm just curious how that works out, but it's really fascinating that the way you frame it can really determine the actual process of how the psychedelic medicine is going to be used and how it will work for the patient.
It can be. It can also be just where the patient is at. So sometimes we have folks who are, for example, deep in the throes of suicidal ideation. And they're talked out. They can't engage in talk therapy anymore. They're just too deep in the well. In those situations, I'm like, you know what? Let's use a Band-Aid. And that Band-Aid can be a pharmaceutical. That Band-Aid can be a psychedelic. Doesn't matter. I need that person to get enough relief that they can hit a baseline place and then decide, are we going to engage or are we not? Personally, the way that I like to work with patients is that my first appointment is an hour long. It's an hour long because it needs to be an hour long. And we do a lot of talking. And I don't do straight up psychotherapy. I'm a little bit more outcomes focused on where's the dysfunction in your thinking here? Where's the disharmony between your spirit and how you're living your life? And once we can see that, it's almost like a layer has already happened before the person takes the psychedelic medicine. And then the psychedelic can just, boom, get really targeted and deep into where it goes. Whereas if you don't do that, the psychedelic might end up working on some of the outer layers, which is still great, but we might not go as deep or as transformational with the work, which is okay too. Not everyone can go super fast, super hard right away. Some people don't ever want to go there. Some people come and they say, I don't want to talk about my mother. I don't care about this woo-woo stuff. I don't want to integrate. I just want to change my brain chemistry. And I say, okay, you're probably not the best fit for my practice, but I could still help you. We could still work with that. And a psychedelic might be a tool for working with that. It's how we use it.
Let me ask you about some of the ways that you perhaps use psychedelic medicines in your practice that might be somewhat outside, the most common usages that we're aware of today and that the research is focusing on, like severe depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and addictions, and so forth. So in your practice, you're working with helping patients manage chronic illness. You're involved in preventive medicine, working with chronic pain, and so forth. So I'm wondering if there are ways in which you incorporate psychedelic medicines in that part of your practice.
It's a good question. It comes back to that philosophy. And sometimes I get invited to write articles or speak about, can you tell us about psychedelics and eating disorders? Can you tell us about psychedelics and anxiety? Can you tell us about psychedelics and chronic pain? And to me, it's always a little funny because it's the same thing. Whatever the dysfunction or disease is, it is an expression of something not being quite right. And when you kind of take off the blinders that a horse has, instead of being super targeted on this is good for pain, this is good for autoimmune disease, this is good for that. That way of thinking is very focused on the disease and not on the person. And something that I love about psychedelics is they're very focused on the person. And so those chronic headaches that you get might actually be related to the insecure attachment style that you have, and you might not even realize it. And something that blows me away with this work is sometimes I go in thinking we're treating one thing, and then by the end of the session, I'm realizing, oh, we're actually treating something very different. And that very different thing is the root of this more superficial problem. And it's both a blessing and a curse. I get bored really easily. And that plays out in my life. I like to travel. I like to move around a lot. I have a lot of interests. And something I love about psychedelic medicine is right when I feel like I've got its number and I understand, oh, okay, this is the pattern. This is how it works. I feel like the medicine goes, oh, really, girlfriend? Watch this. And it completely surprises me and blows me away with its versatility and the way in which it can go deep without being violent. And I think often in our culture, we have two polar opposites here. One is, give me the pill to fix it. I don't want to do my work. The other is, healing has to hurt. Healing is like a punishment. And if you want the wound to heal, you got to grit your teeth and scrub that wound clean with a stiff brush. And it hurts, but that's how you got to do it. Those are two extreme opposites, and there are a million shades of gray in the middle there. And I actually think that psychedelics can hit any of those stages in the middle, too.
That's just so obviously true, these polar opposites in our conventional mindsets around illness and medicine and healing and so forth. And it's really fascinating that you're exploring all these many shades of gray in the middle there in your own practice and with your patients. And so, Morning, you mentioned before that there is some difference between synthetic psychedelic medicines like ketamine and perhaps some of the others that have been synthesized, MDMA, for example, and then some of the more natural psychedelic medicines, psilocybin and so forth. And of course, there are both natural and synthetic forms of those. But in terms of this differentiation between synthetic and natural psychedelic medicines, is there a difference in how you work with those? And this whole process of engaging the patient more in the process. So it's not just this pharmaceutical allopathic approach, but it's a more integrative approach and really dealing with the underlying issues and engaging, helping the patient access their own capacity for self-healing. So again, is there just a differentiation around how you work with that and how that plays out in terms of synthetic versus natural psychedelic medicines?
I think each medicine has its own flavor and its own harmony that it dances with a person. And when I'm working with patients, most of what I do, I would say, comes through my conscious intellectual brain, but there is an element of intuition as well. And sometimes I just get this hit. I'm like, you know what? I really think that you and the spirit of ayahuasca would just work beautifully together. Sometimes I get this hit on people. I'm like, I think for you, you're going to be annoyed and distracted by the spirit of this plant. And let's just go with, I don't know, LSD. Let's just go with ketamine. Let's just have it be a deep dive into your own brain without like the DMT aliens and their carnival show, or and it's not that one is better than the other. It's that they all have their place, and they all work a little differently, and different people are going to like different things. I don't think that synthetics are any worse than the natural ones, to be honest. Sometimes people respond better to natural, sometimes people respond better to synthetic. And I used to be very sanctimonious about that point, especially being trained in herbal medicine. I always thought the herbal thing, it's always better. It's always better to go with nature. And while I would never turn my back on nature, I do think the synthetics bring a lot of value And they can do things that the naturals can't. And the naturals can do things that the synthetics can't. And that's why I think we need all of them.
That's really interesting, and it sounds like you've shifted a little bit away from maybe a bias towards the naturals, and you do see a lot of value and potential in the synthetic psychedelic medicine. So I wonder if you could just say a little more about that and sort of tease out these differences between the synthetic and natural psychedelic medicines, and how you work with those and their capacities for inviting someone into their self-healing capacity, given different things they may be struggling with.
Yeah. So let's take the case of depression, because that's one I see very commonly, and it is the leading cause of disability worldwide is depression. I have seen pharmaceutical medicines help people in certain situations more than any psychedelic has. In other situations, I've seen people fail several antidepressant medications, and then it was that mushroom trip that unlocked their brain and helped them get free. I've also seen people who have tried ayahuasca and psilocybin and this and that and MDMA plus the psilocybin in a variety of settings, clinical, shamanic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ketamine this way, ketamine that way, ketamine rectally, ketamine nasally. And what they really needed was Cymbalta. And once we got them on the right antidepressant, then they could have that level of stability where they could actually engage in therapy, where they could lean in and talk about some of their issues without becoming dysregulated. And I also want to say that doing this work for as many years as I've been doing it, in the way that I've been doing it, the people who come to see me are not the simple cases. And so I know that there are a number of people whose cases were much more straightforward than warranted making an appointment with me. By the time somebody sees me, usually they've already tried a few other things from both sides of the fence. And they're thinking, maybe it's time to give up. And that's where we need to get creative. And that's where we really need to challenge our stories about what medicine can and cannot be. And our stories about, on the conventional side, our stories about psychedelics. And on the shamanic or psychedelic side, our stories about pharmaceuticals and synthetics. And when I graduated from medical school, I was I'll never prescribe an antibiotic, kind of in that camp. And I really got beat up out there in clinical practice because guess what? The rest of the world didn't read Dr. Erica's philosophy on how healing should go, right? They didn't read my guidelines on how it should be. And so I had to bend. I had to bend to meet my patients. And it's like, okay, well, do I want to be right or do I want my patient to heal? I want my patient to heal. I'll also just, since this is a psychedelic summit, I feel like I can get a little woo here. I had a very powerful trip on mushrooms once where I got to speak with the spirit of certain pharmaceutical medicines. It started with opioid medications. And then it went to a number of different pharmaceutical antidepressants. I was like, oh, you have spirits? And I'm like, yeah, we have spirits. And we get no respect and we don't understand why everyone's mad at us. And it was actually quite beautiful, especially to speak with the opioid spirit. Like, we don't understand why everyone's mad at us. You told us you wanted us to make the pain go away, and we do that. So why does everyone hate us? Like, there was this wanting to please and being confused and being a little heartbroken energy there. And then, I spoke with, I think it was, who was it? I think it was fluoxetine, which is generic Prozac. It was like, why does ayahuasca get to wear the tiara all the time? Do you realize I've saved? It's like, you're right. You've actually saved more lives than ayahuasca has. When we look at the population of the world, we haven't even had 1% of the population access psychedelic medicine. Yeah, you have saved more lives than ayahuasca has. You're absolutely right. Maybe I should respect you a little bit more.
So let me ask you, Dr. Zelfman, you lecture widely on psychedelic medicine, psychedelic science, and so on. So I wonder, maybe you do talk about this in your lectures, but I wonder if you could talk here a little bit about these different ways of knowing. The Western scientific, which ranges from the very conventional allopathic to what's arising in Western medicine in terms of integrative and holistic approaches, which is still in the minority of the Western model, unfortunately, but it's there. With more Eastern contemplative worldviews, where consciousness tends to be more primary rather than simply being regarded as an epiphenomenon of neurological processes, and then indigenous worldviews as well. So I wonder if you could just talk about that landscape a little bit as it applies to your work as a integrative health practitioner and a practitioner of psychedelic medicine.
I think that people now are sicker than they've ever been before. Their detox pathways don't work as well. They don't have as much social support. They have higher levels of stress. They have greater access to cheap dopamine hits. I'm thinking in particular of our phones and of processed sugars. Listen, I haven't been doing this for decades, right? You can tell by my face, I'm not in my 80s. And I have a lot of mentors who are. And they've confirmed this. People now are sicker than they were a few decades ago. And they're harder to treat now than they were a few decades ago. So what we were doing a few decades ago might be enough for some. It might not be enough for others. And this is, again, where I come back to, this is a motto I say all the time: use all the tools. Put your judgments aside, use all the tools. You want to build a house, there's no shame in picking up a power tool to do part of that project. Parts of this project, you might want to do the finished work by hand. Beautiful. You might want to hand paint a mural on one of the walls. Great. Or you might want to use a power tool for part of it. What's the goal here? Is the goal to get better? Use all the tools. And so something that the problem with being somewhere in the middle of the camps is that I get garbage thrown at me from both sides. So I get garbage thrown at me from the conventional medical model, and I get garbage thrown at me from the strictly psychedelic natural medicine model. And that's just the cost of doing business. It's the cost of doing business. And one way in which I think that I'm a bit different than some other practitioners is if I have a patient, for example, who is on a pharmaceutical medication and it seems to be working for them, maybe not 100%, maybe 50%, I will not require that they stop taking their medication before we pursue other avenues. Now, I won't be stupid I won't recommend drug-drug interactions that are lethal. But for example, I would say maybe 15 to 20% of the people who I work with who end up healing with psilocybin are on an antidepressant medication when they take psilocybin. And I get some flack for that. And I say, the antidepressants are just numbing these people. You're not helping them thoroughly heal. And I say, okay, or I can pull them off their antidepressant, hugely destabilize them, then give them a psychedelic, which further destabilizes them. And then a month later, they're in psychiatric crisis. Yeah. And I've cleaned up enough of those messes that other practitioners and other retreat centers have caused. I used to work in a retreat center that required people go off their meds. I cleaned up a lot of those messes in my practice. And what ends up happening at the back end of that is that people lose faith in their ability to heal. And that is perhaps the worst thing that you can do for a patient, is snuff out that little spark of hope that they can heal. I think it's really important to fan that flame and to not destabilize people too fast, too hard, especially since we live in a culture in which people are not going to be properly held and nurtured when they destabilize.
Let me go back to something you said earlier about how what you're experiencing and your mentors are sharing with you, that people seem to be actually sicker, and that there seem to be many causes in modern society in terms of our addiction to the dopamine hits we get from our digital life and our cell phones and all the rest of it. And just kind of pervasive anxiety. And as you said, depression is the leading debilitating illness besetting people in our modern society. And so, it does seem that there's a lot of things in the way we're leading our lives today that are actually causing us to be sicker. So at some point, I guess we have to ask ourselves this question: why are we so ill? Why are we collectively so ill?
That's a very good question, because until we ask why are we so ill, we're not going to heal, right? It's like if you came to see me and said, Dr. Erica, my foot hurts, and there was a nail in your foot, and I didn't take the nail out of your foot, doesn't matter how many psychedelics I give you. As long as there's a nail in your foot, you're going to suffer, right? Now, you can learn to walk differently. You can learn to live around the nail, but the nail is there, right? And I wish that I could say there's one smoking gun. I don't think there is. I think there are several. I think one of them is our addiction to productivity has just gone off the rails. I personally have a practice where 25 hours once a week, so one day plus 1 hour every week, I do not use my phone or computer. And when I started doing this, guess what day of the week my anxiety levels were the highest? Right? It was this, I need to be doing something. I need to be fixing something. I need to be working on something, right? Because if I don't, then what? I can't just take up space on the planet, right? I have to earn my place here. And the way that has spilled over is we don't have boundaries around now I'm working, now I'm resting. Now I'm at work, now I'm at home. Now I'm pushing, now I'm playing. And the way that has translated in our nervous systems is we are virtually always in our sympathetic dominant state. So the sympathetic state is the fight or flight state. It's the state you're supposed to be in when you are running away from a cheetah trying to save your life. The problem is our nervous systems don't know the difference between running from a cheetah versus just got a parking ticket versus just got a passive aggressive email from my best friend versus my boss has asked to have a meeting with me. And so we are just riding in our adrenaline, norepinephrine states, and our nervous systems are not designed to have chronic medium to high levels of stress all the time. They're designed to have a big burst, run away from a cheetah, and then come back down to a resting state. And so our nervous systems haven't caught up with the kinds of lifestyles that we have forced ourselves into. That's one thing. Another thing that I think we're doing wrong, I'll just say it that way, is we are pushing our inflammation levels to ridiculously high degrees. And this gets very tricky in my work with patients because nobody wants to feel policed about what they eat or how they live their lives. But we cannot ignore the fact that different foods affect our physiology in different ways. And our consumption of processed sugars has gone off the rails. The building is on fire. And now with this new awareness around the role of serotonin and depression, maybe serotonin doesn't play as much of a role as we thought it did. We can't ignore the role of inflammation in the nervous system. And guess what drives inflammation in the nervous system, right? We probably all eat it several times a day. God help you if you smoke and drink alcohol on top of it, right? And this is where I tell patients, it doesn't matter what psychedelic I give you. If your brain is on fire, you're not going to feel happy. Another piece that I think is really important for us to address is our need for nurturing and support. And this phrase, it takes a village. And now we live in a culture in which individuality and independence are the markers of success and having your stuff together and being a winner in life. And when you live in a culture of hyper individuality, you can't afford to fall apart sometimes. You can't afford to grieve properly when somebody dies. You can't afford to be messy, and life is messy. And so we're all alone, getting high on cheap dopamine with inflamed brains, feeling like we're running from a cheetah 24/7. There's no psychedelic for that. There's no pharmaceutical to fix that one. There's no herb to fix that one. We have many tools to help you get comfortable in that horrible space. Right? But until you pull the nail out of your foot, you're only going to go so far in your healing.
So I think that one of the great gifts from traditional and indigenous cultures is this kind of more cyclical view of life. There's not all just this linear approach of getting more and going faster and faster, and this whole acquisitional mindset, just more and more and more, better, faster, faster. That it's okay to have times of rest and times of expansion, times of contraction. And we don't have to be caught up in this sort of linear race. And then there's also the communal aspect, the importance of community and the deep sense of belonging. So these seems to be two really important things that we've really kind of lost in modern culture that we could learn. We could relearn from traditional and indigenous cultures and ways of knowing this, both this cyclical view of life and the emphasis on community.
And I think this is also where the interface can get a little messy too. A lot of the ways in which we use psychedelics in the quote unquote developed world are quite a bit different than how they were used in shamanic context and how they still are used in shamanic context in places in the world. For example, I help organize peyote ceremonies in Mexico with an indigenous Maracame. And the structure that he has works great for indigenous people and completely doesn't work for others, because in his community, after you do peyote, you go back to your community in which other people do peyote and understand what the medicine entails and celebrate that you've done your work and say thank you for doing your work, right? Whereas here, we go back to our jobs and have to hope nobody knows what we just did, right? And then we go back to feeling isolated. And then we're like, well, how do I integrate all of these lessons into my life? And that's why I think we do need different structures and formats that are not unique, that are, yes, unique to the medicine, but are also unique to the context of the individual. Because what works for a person in an indigenous community in Mexico is not going to work as well for someone who lives in urban Chicago and has a corporate job, if they're going to get the most mileage out of this work.
Well, let me ask you about your own work. So you facilitate these therapeutic, psycho-spiritual experiences for people. So what models do you employ that really frame that work and the process and the healing process that you're inviting and facilitating or co-creating with your patients?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So I try and be patient-centered. So it means I do a little bit of everything. But my favorite model, and I say favorite because I think it works the best, is to do group work, which is antithetical to the American culture in which I was raised. People want to pay 3 times as much, 10 times as much, as long as they get to have Dr. Erica all to themselves all day. Yum, yum, yum. Just me and Dr. Z. And I'm like, okay, you can do that. You're going to heal even better if you come on a retreat that I'm organizing with 10 other people like you, and you all heal together for a week. And then after the week is over, you all stay in touch. And now you have a community of people who understand this work and aren't going to roll their eyes at you or tell you that you're crazy, and who are going to support you through the next phase of your life. So personally, I found the most successful model is not, I'm going to say what's the least successful. The least successful is I took the day off from work. I just dropped the kids off at school. I got to pick them up at 3 p.m. Let's cram in this session, and then I'm going to pick up the kids. Still worth doing. The least transformational model. The most transformational is I took a week away from work. I'm going to come on this retreat. I'm going to become vulnerable. I'm going to witness other people healing, struggling. It's going to be healing for me to see them do their work. It's going to be healing for them to see me do mine. We're going to form community and trust, and we're all going to rise together. One works better than the other. I can't dispute that one works better than the other. One takes a lot more of my time and energy, and guess what? That's the one that works better. Because the medicine is just one part of the medicine. And what happens when we make the medicine all of the medicine is we don't take responsibility for ourselves. We have less agency. We're relying more on shifts in chemistry rather than shifts in our spirit. And we really deny ourselves the powerful medicine of community, of support, not just receiving it, but giving it. How healing is that? If you feel like you might as well be dead, and then you realize, wow, there's some people whose lives are a lot better because I witnessed them in their transformation. It's powerful.
Wow. Yeah. Powerful indeed. So let me ask you, your work with endocrinology and the endocrine system. So I wonder if you could talk about how psychedelic medicines interact with the endocrine system and how that relates to stimulating our capacity for self-healing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So sometimes they're all woven together and sometimes they're not. I just want to say first and foremost, hypothyroidism, meaning an underfunctioning of the thyroid gland, is the number one organic cause of depression. And I am appalled at how many people come to see me and say, I've had depression for 10 years. I've seen 5 doctors. What can you do? And I say, okay, has anyone checked your thyroid? And they say no. So sometimes you don't need mushrooms. You need levothyroxine, right? So there's that bit. But a lot of our endocrine imbalances come from the exact same things I was just talking about. We're riding stress. So our bodies start pulling on other glandular systems to balance out the stress. Our inflammation levels are through the roof. We're addicted to cheap dopamine. While psychedelics don't necessarily reverse all of those changes, sometimes what they do is help us see what's going on, drop the shame, drop the self-blame. Sometimes we don't make changes because we go, oh, I'm such a piece of garbage, I should stop eating sugar. No, as opposed to, you know what, I love myself so much, and this is really something I'm ready to change. That's a very different outcome. So psychedelics can help in that way. Psychedelics can also help in terms of neurogenesis, meaning the brain and the nervous system's ability to grow new cells and healthier cells and make new connections within the nervous system. And a number of endocrine disorders come from an improper communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then the pituitary and whatever organ in the body, whether it's the ovaries, the testicles, the thyroid, the adrenal glands, you name it. And when you have a nervous system that can communicate with its own self better, it's going to function more optimally, and the whole organism is going to function more optimally. And if you heard a story in your childhood, like you overheard a conversation between your mother and your aunt saying, well, wow, isn't he a bit weird? Well, good thing he's gay because he should not be passing along that DNA to a child, right? And then that bounced around in your brain for so long. And then eventually you found yourself in my office because you don't make enough testosterone. Psychedelic medicine can help with that. And so what I often see, it depends on the medicine, but if there is a psychospiritual component to an illness, psychedelics are beautiful. If it's a purely mechanical issue, you probably need something else or something in addition to. You know, if you don't make enough testosterone because you got kneed in the crotch playing basketball in high school and there was an intense injury there, I don't know that psilocybin is going to fix that, honestly, right? But if it's because you had a head injury and now we need to just help your brain get back online, yeah, maybe microdosing would be great, right? So it's knowing what you're treating, and then knowing what's the right tool for what you're treating.
There's been an explosion of interest in psychedelic therapies, clearly, and much wider acceptance in the medical profession. But at the same time, there's this, process of medicalizing and the whole process of FDA approval and the DEA rescheduling and so forth. And I know recently, I think the American Medical Association came out with guidelines somewhat restricting the application of these psychedelic medicines, except for very, maybe narrowly FDA approved interventions and approaches. And I wonder about your thoughts on that in terms of where you see the potential for the application of psychedelic medicines broadly in different types of medicine and healing work, and this is landscape we're in of the ability for practitioners to really help their patients, and then the dynamic of possibly kind of within the medical model of it being more restricted.
Yeah, I just want to first of all say I'm appalled by this new policy, because the policy doesn't say we won't support. The policy says we will oppose. That's aggressive. And this is happening in the face of a raging mental health epidemic, global mental health epidemic. And the field of psychiatry is honestly starting to collapse a bit like a flan in a cupboard right now. We don't have a lot of new stuff happening in psychiatry, and the whole field has become scrutinized pretty hard right now. We need new tools. We need to think about things in different ways. We need to depart from this Descartesian separation of the mind from the body. I don't know what prompted this position, but I'm going to just flat out say I'm ignoring it because there is a chilling statistic here that between the time that research shows something to be true and the time that the average doctor adopts it into their medical practice, there is an air gap of 17 years on average. I don't think we have 17 years. And I know how to read a study. And I know that when I opened my medical practice as a primary care physician, thinking I was going to be treating ear infections and high blood pressure, and when my office was flooded with people with depression and anxiety, I know that the tools I had available to me at that time were not sufficient. So I think it's a tragedy, because what that means is it's going to limit people's access. This medicine is going to continue to be available to people who are either very well connected or have a lot of money. They need healing too, but so does everyone else. Honestly, I was a bit heartbroken when I read that position had been released. Also, maybe coincidence, I have a number of courses online for people to learn about psychedelics. Some of them were developed specifically for healthcare providers to get continuing medical education. One of them is called The Science of Psychedelics. Within a week of hearing that this position had been issued by the American Medical Association, I received notice that my continuing medical education status was being audited for my course. So I don't want to be Chicken Little here, but I do think we might have a witch hunt on our hands. And if they pull my CME status, I'm going to keep teaching people about this work anyways. And folks like you are going to help spread the word, and we'll do this grassroots. And that's okay. That's how many revolutions have happened. It doesn't have to be top down. It would be nice if we could get some allies from the top. We'd help more people more quickly.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, Dr. Zelpin. Thank you so much. And as we wrap up our conversation today, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about this professional training platform, psychedelics.com, and especially what people might expect to find there, and how maybe the approach may differ from some different conventional approaches, or just tell us a little bit about your approach and what people expect to find on this training platform.
The course is available for anybody. But when I was designing it, I really had healthcare providers in mind, because I think it is ridiculous that our patients are hearing about psychedelic medicine from podcasts and articles in Rolling Stone magazine, and that they know more than their doctors do. I think a patient should be able to go to their doctor, go to their psychologist, go to another healthcare provider and say, what about this tool for me? And that the doctor should be able to say something other than, well, it's not FDA approved and you're going to break your brain forever if you tried that, right? We know that that's not appropriate anymore. We need something different. And so the course is not created to be this comprehensive, everything you need to know to be the perfect psychedelic provider, but rather, here's what you should know to distill the hype away from the science. Here's what the data show. Here is what thousands of years of anecdotal evidence shows, right? So psilocybin mushrooms have been in use since 5000 BCE, more than a minute. Here's what it seems to help with. Here's what it doesn't seem to help with. Here are the drug-drug interactions to be aware of. Here are the medical emergencies to be aware of. And if you were to happen to do this work, here is the very minimum that you should know about trip sitting. That you don't sound like an uninformed after-school special, but you sound like an ally who can have a nuanced conversation with people when they ask about this work. And it's also for people who aren't providers, but who just like to know how stuff works, who don't want to hear about the hype, who want to hear about what the clinical research shows without having to plow through all of it themselves, have it explained to them in a way that's easy to understand. And you don't have to be a healthcare provider to understand the information the way that I've presented it in these modules. And so we have 7 modules. So we break it up into bite-sized pieces. One is just on how psilocybin and LSD work on the brain. What's the science? How does it work? We have a module on ketamine. We have a module on MDMA. How does it work and what does the research show? Module on microdosing. We have an entire module just on addiction. How do psychedelics help with addiction and do they? What does the data show? How to trip sit somebody. And then a mini module on music. Because like I said, the medicine is just part of the medicine. And wow, nothing synergizes with this medicine like music does. So it's meant to be a pretty comprehensive primer for someone new to this work or someone who's ready to dive deeper than the same echo chamber hype that we hear in these circles and understand just how sophisticated this medicine is in a more nuanced way.
Well, thank you so much for everything you shared with us today, Dr. Erica. This has just been illuminating and such a value add to the conversations in this summit. So where can people find out more about your work online? Where would you suggest they start?
Thank you. My personal website is drzelfand.com. And I'm also the CEO of a nonprofit organization called Right to Heal. So right as in it is correct, and it is also your right. And that is righttoheal.com.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for being with us today and for everything you shared with us. And thank you so much.